So we're dealing with, ironically, the nature of that which is God, the environment, and if there's any semantic meaning between choice and selection. And when we talk about stories, we have to take into account that something's at work whereby if a story is something which acts as a image or a symbol or significance or somehow contributes to a hierarchy of meaning and value, it's likely, though not definite, but very likely that will influence behavior. Human behavior is part of the environment.
Yes.
And therefore human
Would
behavior...
you like to introduce to the audience the what it is you're doing?
The a priori assumption that is being made here comes from the acknowledgement which many rabbi and religious scholars would agree, especially from the Abrahamic faith, that it is commonly understood in the Yiddish or Hebrew that the meaning of the word Jehovah or God is I am, and precisely more I am that which is. And so if we take that which is as a substitute for the word God, as a better representation for what we mean by it, what we are then able to do is ask the question, what is the definition of the word environment? Often we can attempt to describe what the environment is, and often when we do this, the first pitfall will be removing the human or sapien from it, such that there's a instant separation, which is ironic because that's also referenced in scripture as well. But what we also do is we try and place a finality on it. There's boundaries and limitations. It's either the ecosphere, the microsphere, the planet, the planetary systems, and every time we do that through definition, we create a limitation. And what we know is that there is no limitation. Everything that exists is part of the environment. Everything is a variable in the sum constituency of a very complex equation, whereby every variable is connected to every other variable through a matrix which we can't possibly comprehend. In this experiment, I asked for you to define the environment, and I think this is the best, most succinct answer that I've ever received, which is the construct. So, Marx would call it the substrate. If you want to call it that, you can call it that. You can call it the matrix if you want. You can call it the architecture or the source code. We are really just getting into semantics, because if this is a simulation, it's a source code. If it's the quantum field, then we're talking about essentially wavelengths and mathematics. But everything is part of the maths. Everything that we can observe, everything that exists is part of the same maths. There is no boundary or borders, or there's no circle that can be drawn around any of the variables whereby any other variable is excluded from the equation. What that leads us to is the ability to express the statement that God equals that which is. The environment also equals that which is. And since there could be an extensive philosophical discussion over the differences between choice and a selection, the difference between a choice and a selection may be something more in relation to agency or a finiteness. simply that a selection may be from options that exist or are practical or accessible, whereas a genuine choice may be something that is devoid of limitation. Why this is important? One of the foremost scholars, a member of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, whose job it was as a academic band, so to speak, yet instead of using music, instead deployed their own rhetoric to mock the fundamentalist religious types. Why was this a valid strategy? Because the manner in which the current clerical orders consider cosmic truth and universal truth, and essentially trying to get closer to the divine, is actually quite pathetic and crude and cheesy. And so it's quite easy, if as a scientist you want to debunk a fundamentalist who believes that the material earth was created down the lines of Genesis, as opposed to understanding Genesis as a story whereby metaphors are used not as mere similes or abstractions, but are abstractions to simplify really complex ideas. You take Cain, for example. Cain is the representation of agricultural civilization. Abel is the representation of the shepherding, astrological, herd following, globe trotting civilization. Why civilization? Civilization is about surplus, it is about time, it is about time management. The shepherds followed the herd. They were the herd. The herds followed the birds followed the insects.
Everybody heard the birds a word.
The insects followed the fruit, and the fruit followed the water. The shepherd leads his flock to water. That's how Cain would have written the story. Abel had the ability to have been the victor and written the tale as it should stand, would have written the flock leads the shepherd to water. Okay, what does that mean? That basically means that we are at odds whenever we are using the language of science to combat or to antagonize theoretically, intellectually with religion. It's a moot point. They are two entirely different languages to describe entirely different processes. If you just turn Genesis on its head a little bit and say, okay. So in the beginning was the Word, John chapter 1 verse 1, and all that was with him, and all that was the Word. Okay, it also says in the beginning in Genesis. Could it be fair to take any sentence in the text where it says in the beginning and merge those verses together such that you have a more accurate depiction of what it is that is being understood at these moments? So in the beginning was the Word. Okay, cool. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Might it be that when it's spoken of God creating the heavens and the earth, that it's speaking of the emergence of an abstraction, and that until this abstraction was understood, there was no abstraction. There was trees, there were leaves, there were stones, there was water. Until it became understood that that which was above wasn't of this earth. And the reason why my gut reaction leans towards this poetical interpretation that the Genesis is about the emergence of being and the sentience that we now cherish and experience being what is described as being created, is because there is no objective measurement that can exist without celestial observations. It's also very likely that if a group of hominoids that had time, and I'll come back to the time a bit again in a minute, if a group of hominoids that had time were able to notice that they were in the same location seasonally, and were able to then essentially begin a process of trigonometry to understand where they were in relation to where they were last year, and through grandfather, father, son, grandmother, mother, daughter, through the oral tradition, be able to pass down the navigation of the planet and the stars. But not only through that, because then what emerges from that in Sumeria, for example, is the hexadecimal system, which is degrees. It's through degrees you get degrees as in 360 degrees, as in the ability to, from a circle, reference arcs and angles, and from that we are able to basically begin the fundamentals of trigonometry, which is geolocation. And once we have that, once we have time, we're then able to then begin measuring speed. We are then able to start looking at measurements such that we can record a phenomena such that it has a meaning, whereby a standard exists, whereby there is a constant, and the constant is a mathematical truth based on an observation, and without celestial observations there can be no objective measurement. I mean, I'd argue that there can't be any objective measurement in the full truth of it, but anything close to a reality that exists outside of our minds must be negotiated through consensus, using as much as possible tools which there is no argument about. No argument. There is no argument. Okay. Why does this matter? It matters. I said there. It matters. It matters because Dawkins was right to mock the manner in which clerical orders, the cloisters, creeds, and the way in which corrupt power hierarchies have used the text, not the understanding of the text, not the meaning of the text, not the history of the text, not the relationship that the text has with the emergence of consciousness and the word, but instead picking and choosing the sentences that they find most fitting to substantiate their behaviour. That's what Christopher Hitchens, Steve Jones, and Richard Dawkins